She was an Austrian girl, and maybe that was the problem. Marie Antoinette was one of the daughters of Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and Empress Maria Theresa, part of the Habsburg dynasty. But at the age of 15, her family gave her in marriage to another teenager. Louis was the Dauphin of France, the future heir to the French throne. The teen alliance, the royal marriage, was intended to cement a relationship between the two warring countries. Unfortunately, it didn't work out at all. Marie Antoinette was Austrian, and there was no way she was going to fit in on the other side of the Rhine River over in Paris. As the Queen of France, she naturally paid more attention to the interests of her home country. And of course, France and Austria were still bitter enemies. Well, critics accused her of being involved in the infamous Diamond Necklace affair of 1785. Worst of all, she lived in absolute caviar-wasting extravagance, while the people out on the streets literally starved to death. The parties went on at the Palace of Versailles, and when told that the peasants under her rule had no bread to eat, she'd said to have responded, "Let them eat cake." Well, things went from bad to worse for the mismatched couple with such opposite views in life. On October 5, 1789, with the French Revolution just starting, several thousand people marched on Versailles, presented their demands to the king and queen, and literally dragged them back to Paris. After nearly 2 years of house arrest, Marie suggested that they try to escape. But their disguises failed, and the people in the streets turned them back. Almost 2 years later, the revolutionists executed Louis XVI, and on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette, not quite 38 years old, also went to the guillotine. Well, in the last section, we tried to put a positive spin on the counsels of the Apostle Paul and show that he actually favored good marriages and wanted them to work in Christian homes. Now, just a page or two later, we're talking about the failed marriage, the cut short marriage, if you'll pardon the pun, of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Why? Beginning in verse 12, Paul addresses something that's an extremely practical question. What should happen in a marriage in which the husband and wife hold diametrically opposite viewpoints? Specifically, in which one partner in the marriage relationship is a Christian and the other is not. Now, that's not the exact same circumstance as our friends from French history, Marie Antoinette and her boyfriend Louis. But there certainly are similarities. How should the Christian husband or wife cope with a battle zone situation like that one? Now, we need to emphasize one biblical principle immediately. First of all, a marriage like the one we've just described is never, let me repeat, never supposed to begin in the first place. A marriage in which only one of the two participants is a follower of Jesus Christ should never start. In verse 39, Paul explicitly talks about a person's options if his or her mate dies. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. But he must belong to the Lord. In Paul's second letter to the same church in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14, he expressly says God's will even more clearly. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? It has in mind any binding relationship, but especially a marriage. One Bible commentary notes, No other principle has been more strictly enjoined by God. Throughout the history of God's people, the violation of this principle has inevitably resulted in spiritual disaster. So, a marriage between a Christian and a non-Christian should not happen. But here's a common scenario. Two people have been married for a while, and then one of them becomes a Christian. One out of the two is converted and gives his or her heart and life over to Jesus. The other part doesn't. Immediately you've got one train trying to go down two sets of tracks. Or consider the flip side of the coin. A marriage begins with both partners as Christians. Then one of them freely chooses to sever any connection with Christ. Again, what's the result? One home, two viewpoints. There was a little cartoon once that didn't need a caption, and it illustrated this very scenario. The husband, with his golf bag draped around his neck, tugs on one half of a $20 bill. Behind him, a sign proclaims that the Las Vegas golf course is right up ahead. On the wife's side of that bill, and she pulls on it just as hard, is a church. And she'd like to put that money in the offering plate. That's just the tip of the iceberg, but you get the point. What does the Bible teach about such situations? Listen to 1 Corinthians 7, verses 12 and 13, our thought for today. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. Clearly, both verses shine a spotlight on a million struggling real homes here in the 2020s. It is something that happens every single day. Such difficult stories have touched my own family, and our broadcast ministry received constant letters from people caught in such situations. In April 1996, when our broadcast team visited the Philippines for a nationwide Christian Bible crusade, a pastor of a cult group came to the nightly meetings and seriously considered leaving that dangerous organization and joining the body of Christ. But one of the first things he told our team member, Pastor David DeBias, was that my wife doesn't believe what you're presenting. She would oppose me in this decision. It's a hard thing to go ahead and be baptized knowing that you're on a collision course toward having a fractured family and home, breaking up. So right away we have to be sympathetic toward the homes that find themselves in such predicaments, and they do. We need to empathize with both parties. It's tough when your husband or wife does an abrupt U-turn in life and all of a sudden you're on a different highway than he or she is. We've all experienced small ways where we thought our spouse had engineered a mid-course correction and we didn't like it. Come on, we protest. You weren't like this when we got married. The non-believer certainly does have a legitimate complaint. Why then does Paul give us such unbending counsel? If your mate isn't a Christian, he says, you have no options. God expects you to stay with that husband or wife. Verse 14, today's Living Bible, gives us the reason. Perhaps the husband who isn't a Christian may become a Christian with the help of his Christian wife. And the wife who isn't a Christian may become a Christian with the help of her Christian husband. Otherwise, if the family separates, the children might never come to know the Lord, whereas a united family may, in God's plan, result in the children's salvation. Other versions, including the King James, almost suggest that God actually looks at that whole family as being his because of the one Christian in the home. The unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband, says the New International Version. You know, we encounter countless unforgettable stories of humble, faithful Christian women who have spent 30 and 40 years continuing to love a mean, unshaven, unsaved, unsober, wife-ignoring husband. Guy staggers home at 3 o'clock in the morning with 3 of his fellow boozers, and the wife quietly gets up and fixes a snack for them. Why? Why for 40 years does she endure a rotten marriage to a man whose bloodshot eyes see everything differently? It's because she knows that 40 years is nothing next to the eternity of heaven. And down deep, she would love to spend that eternity with the man she still believes God could transform her husband into. And of course, gender-wise, such stories of courage run both directions, believe me. This actually happened in the home of Jeannie's mother, who never stopped praying for Jeannie's dad. And it paid off. Despite the toughness of this Bible teaching, I'm thankful for the fairness of our God. What happens if one person's a Christian and their partner wants out? In verse 15, Paul shares what God's will is. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. All through these hard verses, we find a similar thread and goal: the vibrant, strong attractiveness of the Christian faith. The Christian partner in a mixed marriage should be the most loving, the kindest, the most patient half. He or she should be the one who doesn't insist on 50-50, but is willing to simply give 100% of devotion and faithfulness and long-suffering and love. Only heaven has a full record of some of the heroes and heroines who've obeyed what it says in 1 Corinthians 7. I come from a family of pastors, and my relatives' parishes had many such families. Yet we never knew. Plenty of quiet courage went on almost underneath our own noses, and we were unaware of it. But God knows it all. And He's coming with a reward for those who endured.